Yes. Yeah, I'm going to turn it on, but then
Yes. Did that work?
Yes.
Then I'll turn it off. Test, can you hear me?
And you're welcome to sit here.
To our audience on Zoom, thank you very much for joining. We will begin shortly.
So are we good? Okay, well, greetings, everyone. And for those of you who are here in person, welcome to UCLA and to our Hmong Learning Center auditorium. My name is Professor Ann Hovannisian, and it is my honor and privilege as the director of the Promise Armenian Institute at UCLA to welcome you to this very special event, the first of our annual Kerr Family Lectures. This endowed lectureship, which was created this year with the support of the Promise Armenian Institute and the Kerr family, and with special support of Dr. Eric Israelian, we have the aim of amplifying the stories of heroes and heroines who provided life-saving humanitarian support for victims and survivors of violence and mass atrocities in times of crisis. And who would be more fitting as the subject of the inaugural Kerr Family Lecture than the Near East Relief and the Kerr family themselves? Hence the title of this evening's event, The Extraordinary Humanitarian Legacy of the Near East Relief and 3 Generations of Kerrs, Warriors of Peace. This legacy started with Stanley and Elsa Kerr, who more than 100 years ago helped to bring Armenian refugees and orphans to safety during and after the Armenian Genocide, and continued in their progenitors, including their late son, Malcolm, a UCLA professor and president of the American University of Beirut, their daughter-in-law, our dear Ann Kerr, who has served UCLA so faithfully in building bridges of international understanding through the Fulbright program, as well as their children, whose remarkable contributions have enriched our society in so many areas, ranging from international development and understanding to anti-terrorism and anti-gun violence to professional sports and so much more. And so we are honored today to recognize the Kerr family, all of them, including other descendants of Stanley and Elsa Kerr, as well as their legacy through this important inaugural event. And I cannot help but mention that today, at a point in time when the Armenian people in Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh, continue to experience a humanitarian crisis triggered by a blockade by Azerbaijan of the Lachin corridor, it is also fitting that our minds are drawn back 100 years to remembrance of the victims of the Armenian Genocide. In recent months, Armenians worldwide have been asking, why is the world ignoring the terrible plight of our people? Who will help these suffering Armenians in this forgotten region? Amid a worldwide focus on other crises, including the tragic war in Ukraine. Well, 100 years ago, something even more tragic was taking place during the Armenian Genocide, as over 1.5 million Armenians perished at the hands of the Ottoman Turks, while the world's attention was focused on World War I. But 100 years ago, there were heroes, largely unsung, who behind the scenes worked to save thousands of lives. And many of us of Armenian descent owe our family's very survival to the work of those heroes and heroines, including selfless Americans such as Stanley and Elsa Kerr. So we take heart in remembering those who came to the rescue of our people 100 years ago, and it is our hope and prayer that their story will embolden and inspire present-day heroes in their service to humanity for the people of Artsakh and elsewhere all around the world. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speakers for this evening's event, which again is titled The Extraordinary Humanitarian Legacy of the Near East Relief and 3 Generations of Kerrs, Warriors of Peace. Our featured presenter is filmmaker Ani Hovannisian, known to many of us in the US through her recent documentary, The Hidden Map. In 2022, this film achieved the rare distinction of having nationwide distribution on PBS, airing over 2,000 times in the United States. The Hidden Map has earned more than a dozen international awards and honors at festivals and special screenings, notably in the UK Parliament. Ani is now working on a documentary project that highlights the extraordinary humanitarian legacy of 3 generations of the Kerr family. And hence she was the perfect choice to speak to us this evening. Ani is a member of the Directors Guild of America, the Television Academy, and has been actively involved in the Armenian community worldwide. But now, just prior to Ani's presentation, we will have introductory remarks to put the work of the Kerrs and their family in context on the subject of Americans as eyewitnesses of the Medz-Yaghern, or Great Crime. We in the Promise Armenian Institute family are truly honored and humbled to welcome to the stage our own Dr. Richard Hovannisian, Emeritus Professor of History at UCLA, the prior holder of the Armenian Educational Foundation Chair in Modern Armenian History, which is now named for him, and one of the world's foremost scholars on the Armenian Genocide and the First Republic of Armenia. Richard is the author of 4 volumes on the First Armenian Republic and numerous volumes on the Armenian Genocide, as well as historic Armenian cities and provinces. And for many decades, he taught at UCLA, and he and his students conducted, as most of you know, well over 1,000 interviews with genocide survivors, which are now part of the Shoah Foundation collection. He is the recipient of hundreds of awards, too numerous to mention today, but it is now my distinct pleasure and privilege to welcome him to our stage for introductory remarks. So Richard, welcome.
Thank you, dear. Thank you, Dr. Karagosian. You're always very generous in your introductions. And dear members of the Kerr family and the founders and organizers and maintainers of the Promise Institute and friends of the UCLA and the community for this auspicious event of the inaugural of the Kerr family lectureship. I had the enriching experience of being a colleague of Malcolm Kerr, a political scientist who, with his wife Ann, was committed to peace and justice in the Middle East. Through Malcolm, Vartier and I met his father, Stanley, and mother, Elsa. Stanley was generally a quiet and soft-spoken man, and Elsa was a formidable, self-confident woman. Stanley had been writing his memoir of his time in Marash and in Syria and Lebanon. Over dinner at our home with Stanley, Elsa, Malcolm, and Ann, I agreed to write the introduction to his memoir, Lions of Marash, especially as I too was studying the return of the Armenian deportees to Marash and other Cilician cities after World War I. I had acquired many documents on the subject, one of which was a journal of 3 weeks by a YMC official on the siege of Marash by the Turkish nationalists in January and February of 1920. I want this evening to put aside these notes and just give you a little background about the American presence in the Ottoman Empire and Turkey in the 19th and 20th century. In the 19th century, there was the American Board, the American Board for Foreign Missions, American Commissioners for Foreign Missions, largely created by Congregationalists to spread the word of Christ around the world from China to the Ottoman Empire, and hundreds of dedicated, young, educated persons, including physicians and missionaries and nurses and teachers, volunteered to travel to the difficult life in underdeveloped countries for the mission that they felt was significant. And as it happened in Turkey or the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, they created a whole network of schools and clinics and outposts that stretched 900 miles from Constantinople to Van and Mardin, with all of these cities in between populated by Armenian or by schools and educational and medical facilities. There were 7 American colleges in Turkey by the end of the 19th century. And there were 10 American hospitals stretching again from Aintab all the way to Mardin in the very far east. And if you can look at I hope you can make out the map as I speak. I don't have a pointer, but look at the breadth, the width and the breadth of this country, and know that the Americans were there everywhere. And although they didn't limit their services to Armenians, it so happened that Armenians were the most thirsty for education and enlightenment. And therefore, the student bodies of most of their colleges were made up overwhelmingly of Armenian and lesser degree of Greek and Bulgarian youngsters. It is here that in the great turmoil, starting in the reign of Abdul Hamid in the 1890s, and continuing through the great crime, Medzierern of 1915, actually 1914 to 1918, these hundreds, and there were hundreds, of American men and women became witness to the greatest tragedy of the turbulent centuries of Armenian history. And they became the eyewitnesses to the great crime. I've read recently many of their memoirs, and they brought home the message that our approach probably of trying to impress the world that 1.5 million Armenians perished in 1915, 1918, is not very effective in a world with billions of people and millions of victims. 1.5 million doesn't sound all that astounding. But bring it down to the faces of the individuals whom these missionaries describe, their young students, their teachers, their colleagues, who have a name, who have a face, who have fear, who beg for intervention, who plead in English because they've been in the English schools. And the great frustration of so many of these American humanitarians of trying to do what they could to intervene, sometimes having a little influence with the authorities and governors, sometimes to get reprieves for Armenian Protestants and Catholics, only to find that it's a very short reprieve and that the Catholics and our Protestants were going to follow the apostolics to their death. Sometimes there were the brave ones who stood up to the authorities, and I think most of all probably of Mary Louise Graffam in Sepastia, in Sevas, who with her brother-in-law Parsons had been there for years teaching and heading a girls' school. And when all the young girls from Sepastia, Sivas, were deported toward the desert, Mary Louise, a 6'6" woman, domineering woman, walked with her girls as far as she could go until she was physically turned back at Malatya and forced to return. But even then, continuing to remain in Sepastia, even after the United States had withdrawn most American citizens when the diplomatic relations were severed in 1917. And she commanded awe and respect by the Turkish authorities for her determination. And she became a large champion of Armenian independence after the war. I had made a list of other such heroes. Clarence Usher in Van, who was with the Armenian people as they underwent self-defense and then a tragic withdrawal from Van to the Caucasus, to Echmiadzin, during which thousands of them were ambushed and killed by Kurdish tribesmen. By Ida Stapleton, who went mad because her teachers, her Armenian teachers in her English American school were imprisoned, and she could hear their shrieks at night. By George at Marzavan, the principal, who tried to protect his students and was assured that they would be all right, but found soon that they had been put into prisons and killed. There was no uniformity, absolute uniformity in the Armenian Genocide. It took place in many ways and in many places. In the gorge of Kemach near Erzincan or Erzurum, thousands of them were killed and dumped into the Kemach Gorge while their wives were imprisoned and their children violated. Perhaps the largest American establishments were in Kharpert. That's sort of interesting because the American Armenian community of 100 years ago was very much from that very province of Kharpert, where there was the Riggs family for generations who had ministered to the Armenians and who were the head of Euphrates College, a highly respected and touted school on the heights above the city of Harpert, where many of our forefathers came from. And yet they were unable, having so many connections, to protect their Protestant Armenian professors who were taken out and tortured. Buchikhanyan, Donabed, Lulejan, Garabed, and others who were tortured to death by being their beards pulled, their fingernails, and others who went mad, absolutely mad, not able to. This is the Armenian Genocide. Seeing these pictures mentally of whom the missionaries and teachers are describing. It was a relief, I suppose, not I suppose, I know, that in October, November 1918, after first widespread massacres in Erzurum, the massacres didn't begin in 1915, they began in 1914 in the eastern provinces near the Russian frontier, where my own father-in-law's family with 7 daughters were wiped out at the end of 1914. And then the great deportations and massacres that extended over 1915 and 16. And as I say, in many different ways, but the end purpose and goal was the elimination of the Armenian people in their historic lands in the Ottoman Empire. At the end of the war, after various relief attempts and efforts to help the starving Armenians by the American Committee for Relief in the Near East and other such organizations that were supported by the Woodrow Wilson administration. At the end of the war, it became possible for Americans to return and in an organized manner to try to bring about greater relief to the Armenian survivors and to help them to repatriate to their abandoned homes, those who had survived and were spread throughout the deserts in Syria and everywhere, and encouraged them to return to Aintab and Adana and Marash and Hajan and all the Western Armenian town or the Western towns in Western Turkey, such as Adabazar and Bardizag, Bursa, Eskişehir, Adabazar. Everywhere, Armenians had been everywhere. They had schools and silk factories everywhere. And so the effort was to bring them back. They never succeeded in going back to Harpert or to Sepastiao or to Erzurum, the eastern provinces. They were not allowed to go. There was defense against allowing them to return, but they did return to Cilicia under the protection of the British and the French. And then at that time, the Americans, through the Act of Congress, created the Near East Relief Organization. And this is where Stanley and Elsa enter the picture, because they were young humanitarians and idealists who volunteered for service with the Near East Relief as teachers, as educators, humanitarians. And as it happened, the two were assigned to Marash, large, beautiful city where the American presence had been long, and where 1/3 of the population nearly was Protestant, a very significant portion was Catholic, the rest apostolic, and there they became the angels of mercy on the one hand, and the witnesses to the beginning of a second genocidal operation, now not against the victims who had perished during World War I, but the victims after World War I who had thought they were safe and returned to their homes to rebuild, because Armenians have this homing sense of wanting to rebuild as they had done many times, only to find that they were to be betrayed once again, with the French who were there to protect them, withdrawing without telling the Armenians in the middle of night in a freezing blizzard in February. And when the Armenian inhabitants of Marash learned what was going on, they fled to catch up with the retreating French who didn't have the courtesy, the humanity to inform even the Armenian leaders with whom they had eaten dinner the night before that they were going to withdraw suddenly from Marash, as they did. And thousands of Armenians, poor Armenians, terror-stricken, fled into the blizzard after the French, where thousands of Armenians perished. And those who remained in Marash were left to the mercies of the Turkish nationalists and their flame inciters. Stanley and Elsa were the living witnesses to these events, and their letters and their writings leave nothing to imagination. They are compelling, and they put faces on people, which makes it all the more compelling. Their mission, after they were expelled and the Armenian survivors and orphans were expelled, transferred to Lebanon and Syria, along with other orphans who were transferred to Palestine and to Greece. And there, along the seashores of Lebanon, they spent a great part of their life tending to the surviving children of the genocide and dedicating themselves to it. And about that, Ani Hovannisian will speak to us. But what I will conclude with simply is that the legacy of Stanley and Elsa Kerr, fortunately, has been passed down and embraced by the Kerr family, whom we welcome and honor this evening.
Thank you so much. What a magnificent context you
Thank
put us in. Ani, welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You, Papa. Hello. Good evening. I feel so far removed. I'd like to be with you. Good evening, dear Kerr family, UCLA family, and friends. I'm honored to be here with you tonight for this inaugural event of the Kerr Family Lectureship, which could not be more ideally envisioned. So thank you, UCLA Promise Armenian Institute. Now to the extraordinary story of the Kerrs, which came to life for me about 6 years ago when I picked up Stanley Kerr's The Lions of Marash from my father's overwhelming library. I knew the Kerrs. My father and Malcolm had been colleagues here at UCLA. Steve and I had been students together at Palisades High School. There was a family connection, but it wasn't until I read Stanley Kerr's jaw-dropping eyewitness accounts of Marash under siege and his heroic efforts to save the Armenians that I realized that there is a much deeper story to discover. So that's what I'm doing and what I'm happy to share with you. I like telling stories visually, so we'll start with a short video to set the stage.
Steve Kerr just came out on the floor and listened to this ovation. I've been incredibly lucky in my life to live the way I have, to grow up in the family that I grew up in, because everybody in my family just wants to help others. My grandparents saved a generation of children, and I tell Steph Curry to shoot the ball from 30 feet out and make a good shot. Our family has this incredible Armenian connection because of the work my grandparents did. They were relief workers. I think it made me more compassionate, and it also made me appreciate our own country for the joy that we were allowed every day. One of the great playoff runs of all time is complete.
Beyond the thrill of basketball and 9 NBA championships is the bigger story of Kerr, a family of warriors, warriors of peace during a century of struggle and sacrifice. It took more than 30 years after Steve and I were students together at Palisades High School in Los Angeles for the magnitude of this story to hit me. But when it did, it took me across the world to places where 3 generations of Kerrs have left their monumental imprint.
I'd like to welcome home our customers who live in Beirut and to wish those of you visiting an enjoyable stay.
Retracing their giant footsteps of goodwill that led me to Lebanon and Egypt, and back to the States.
Good morning.
Cleveland, New York,
There you are.
and to Steve's childhood home in Pacific Palisades, California,
It's the family history wall.
where with his father, Malcolm, that championship shot and spirit were made. And where this story begins.
So the story begins, and our evening together as we journey back through a century of remarkable courage and humanity in the face of ravaged inhumanity. But first, I'd like to focus on the present, on a person here today who has witnessed and nourished the Kerr legacy for nearly 3/4 of a century, the mighty matriarch of the family, Ann Zwicker Kerr. In her understated way, Ann has humankind in mind with just about everything she does. In fact, she just came from a class at North Campus near Bunch Hall, where every week she invites visiting international Fulbright scholars to talk with undergrads about their culture and their country, about their perception of the United States, and to give the young students a more informed and sensitive view of the world. She believes that with knowledge, mutual understanding, and compassion, people and nations can learn to cooperate and live better together. This comes from a woman who has spent much of her life living in conflict zones, a woman who has lost her husband to an act of terror, but who refuses to lose faith in humanity. Last month, Ann let me visit one of her classes near Bunch Hall, a familiar place, and on this day, all about Portugal, there was a surprise visitor. And this was the fellow here who was telling us about Portugal. But we had a surprise visitor, not we, they did. Ann's son, Steve Kerr, grew up running around this campus. His father, Malcolm, taught here for 20 years. And the Kerrs' favorite hangouts were Poly Pavilion and the UCLA Rec Center, as were ours. Here is an early self-portrait, and you get a sense of Steve's loyalties. And students had no idea that their teacher is the famous coach's mother, I'm sorry. The reality is that for the 30 plus years that she has been coordinating the Fulbright Scholars Program and teaching at UCLA, and throughout her life, Ann has avoided the spotlight and focused rather on each person's unique story and potential. As for her children, John, Susie, Steve, and Andrew, Ann is equally proud of each of their achievements and commitment to human rights. She calls them her 2 PhDs, 1 MBA, and 1 NBA. Susie, Dr. Susan Kerr van de Ven, is here with us tonight from Cambridge, England, where she's an elected official. She's a counselor working for the good of the people. She is also an important keeper of the Kerr family history, along with cousin Margie. John, too. Susie did her undergraduate thesis about her grandfather Stanley Kerr's volunteer work with the Near East Relief, focusing on his efforts to help the Armenians of Marash, though we'll see that his involvement extended much beyond. She explains that it all started because on their grandfather's 80th birthday, she and her brothers were producing a play for him about the highlights of his life. So she started asking him questions that led to a series of letters from grandfather to granddaughter shortly before he passed away. Letters to Susie, along with many others he'd written half a century earlier, became the inspiration for her thesis, which she dedicated to her grandmother, Elsa Reckman Kerr, Stanley's lifelong partner in adventure and goodwill. These incredible historical documents that, by Stanley's request, had been saved by the family, captured the course of history, particularly Armenian history in the Ottoman Empire, as the survivors of the genocide were struggling to start their lives over again. The family entrusted many of these letters to the Zorian Institute, where they were digitized. So these, along with other family treasures shared by the Kerr, Miller, Jessup, and Reckman families, the children and grandchildren, particularly the senior Kerrs, Doug and Mary Ann. Doug is Stanley and Elsa's son and their daughter-in-law. Dorothy, their daughter, and Ann, their daughter-in-law. Near East Relief and other archives, and books written by the family all come together here with enough time to share just a glimpse. I am working on a documentary about the incredible Kerr family legacy that continues to impact and uplift people across the world. But there's still a lot of work to do, and we're on that road. So the videos I'm sharing with you tonight aren't intended for public broadcast. I just want to give you a behind the scenes look and a deeper appreciation for the Kerrs' lofty human spirit. So let's head now from Los Angeles to Beirut.
We're in the study, we call it the study. Is this where Malcolm would type and work? And yeah, right here. These are Susie, John, Steve, Andrew, and obviously that was a long time ago. And there's Malcolm over there.
My dad was born and raised in Beirut. Went to school on the East Coast, Deerfield, and went to Princeton, and but went back to AUB where he met my mom. My mom was on her junior year abroad from Occidental College, and that's where they met. And so it's an incredible story.
Oh, I was teaching in Beirut, in the Armenian school. And but the international part was added just by going to Beirut as a student. Ignited my adventurous spirit. We were in it together in our mission.
Malcolm and Ann's mission in Middle Eastern Odyssey were in many ways similar to Stanley and Elsa's before them. But for now, I'll focus on something Ann mentioned, teaching in an Armenian school. When she docked in Beirut and before AUB classes even began, Ann, just 20 years old, ventured out and was introduced to a group of girls at an Armenian Catholic school, where the head Mairabed, the mother superior, asked her to become their English teacher. It turns out these animated teenagers didn't speak English, just enough to ask her if she knows Marilyn Monroe or Doris Day, and to tell her that she looks like Doris Day. In time, they were able to convey to Ann the tragic stories about their parents' and grandparents' flight from the Turks years before, and how they resettled in other places in the Middle East. Stories that would become a meaningful part of Ann's life. And an interesting, if unrelated side note, around the same time, my father, Richard Hovannisian, also traveled to Beirut to study. He went to learn Armenian at Nisham Palanjian Gemaran, a well-known Armenian school just a few minutes from AUB. While there, he, like Ann, also became an English teacher to the Armenian students. Little did my father, Ann, Malcolm, and his parents know that their lives would soon intersect. It's like a fairy tale, Ann and Malcolm's romance with AUB, with Lebanon, and with one another. From their first Ottoman history class together, to strolls through the Oval Garden, and by their beloved banyan tree that Malcolm had climbed as a kid. Mesmerizing concerts in the chapel and visits to the Marquand house that would one day become their home. And the athletic field below, which, by the way, was constructed by survivors of the Armenian Genocide, with the involvement of Stanley Kerr in 1924. It was like going back in time as I retraced their footsteps, how Ann met Malcolm's mother, AUB's fair-minded Dean of Women Students, not knowing that she would soon be her mother-in-law, and Malcolm's father, the good-humored professor of biochemistry in the medical school, about whose heroic past she had no idea yet. Falling in love, getting married, earning postgraduate degrees, and having children. 1, 2. Oh, we're stuck. There. 4. Susan, John, Steve, and Andrew. 3 of the 4 were born at AUB. And Ann's watercolors, her expressions of love for Lebanon and the Middle East. Here is Ein Rese, I don't know if I said it correctly, where they lived as a young family, and the street art that welcomed me there 3 years later. Stunning beauty, crushed by civil war, feuding powers and politics, rebuilding, growing, Ann and Malcolm planting roots, teaching in the Middle East, and here at UCLA, a lifetime in a paragraph. And then in 1982, Malcolm, by now a world-renowned Middle East scholar, was offered the job of his dreams. So in times of terror, turmoil, and promise, Dr. Malcolm Kerr, with Ann's support, moved back to his birthplace and gave his all to make the American University of Beirut the place of his and everyone's dreams, an oasis of free thinking, a bridge to peace.
Is this where you keep all your videos? Maybe I could borrow
This one? Sure.
Malcolm Kerr, a 52-year-old American father of 4, came from the University of California at Los Angeles to cap a distinguished academic career in 1982 by becoming president of the American University. Author of 4 major books on the Arab world, Kerr was born in Beirut and had dedicated his life to improving the quality of education in the Middle East.
We've got things like this in our culture, in our society, that are really fundamental: education, medical care, research. open doors. We will survive political controversy, and we'll put the best foot forward for the United States, and I think everybody will appreciate it. So we're going to hang in there.
Colleagues at the Westwood campus mourned Kerr's death, recalling that when he visited last month, they tried to persuade him to come back to UCLA, but he was dedicated to Lebanon.
I believe that he returned knowing the dangers, but hoping that he could bring about peaceful change, bringing together the many factions in that country that seem to war so continuously.
Despite the war, AUB was regarded as the best university in the Arab world. Kerr tried to keep Lebanon's divisive politics off the university's campus, but he was not overly concerned for his own safety.
Malcolm Kerr was born in Beirut in 1931. His father was a professor at the medical school of the American University of Beirut. His mother was the dean of women's students. Malcolm Kerr died in the same hospital in which he was born.
He was killed only because of his nationality being American. And it was ironic because he had spent his whole life in trying to foster peace in the Middle East. He was in heaven while he was doing his job, but it only lasted a few months.
To this day, students in places around the world where Malcolm and Ann taught live by his teaching.
He was like there for everything, with his open-mindedness, tolerance. He was really a great teacher and a very nice human being, very human. And he was also the first non-Armenian who talked to me about the Armenian Genocide. And I was like, wow. An American is talking to me about the genocide and not in general, from personal experience of his father.
He represented I think, the best of what America had to offer.
He was about building bridges and bringing peace. And some people were saying it's not safe, don't go. And he said, like my mother, he said, I promised I would go and I will go.
I think it was the same motivation that sent him back to AUB as sent his parents to Marash. I think that their devotion to human rights started with Elsa and Stanley.
My parents had kept this program from Malcolm's memorial service at UCLA and gave it to me. The Kerr's dear friend, Dr. Hovannisian, offered the invocation at the service. I believe he and his wife are watching tonight. My mother Vartiter's notes on the program tell a story. AUB, Sanctuary of Learning, Peace, Good, where Malcolm and Ann felt at home. Malcolm believed in diversity, moral courage, humility. And then Elsa. Elsa said, there was work to be done in Turkey after World War I. Better to learn about those with whom we're at war. She lived by those words. Elsa Reckman was born in 1896 in Cincinnati, Ohio, to German parents. She was a young girl when her mother and brother died of tuberculosis, leaving her and her siblings to be raised by relatives. And when he could, her father. It wasn't easy, but Elsa was strong and determined. And I wonder if her own difficulties during childhood awakened in her a deeper sense of compassion and desire to care for others later. In high school, she excelled not only in academics, but in basketball and drama. She graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Beloit College, Wisconsin, 1 year early, captain of the basketball team, and she began teaching. She was an adventurer and a humanitarian at heart. So when she heard that the American mission was looking for volunteers to help victims of the Turkish atrocities in the Ottoman Empire, she jumped. She wanted to be a teacher there too, but first she'd have to spend a year in Constantinople learning Turkish at the mission's newly established language school. Here's her passport application from 1920. The American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, the earliest American missionary organization that had a very large presence in the Ottoman Empire, appealed on Elsa's behalf to the US Department of State. She will engage in missionary work under our services. She is cordially commended as a loyal American, and we would recommend that a passport be granted to her. I imagine Elsa's journey. Writings from that first year in Constantinople tell us about the program and about her, even little things like this saying in the first line, Elsa, but my conscience just won't let me. Her experiences there also put a face on the people whom she had gone to help. Visiting an Armenian refugee camp in Constantinople in December 1920, she wrote, "This particular one was housed within the compound of an Armenian church. Of all the distressing circumstances of deportations and massacres, one certainly finds them among these people. A few days back, many of them were people of position and even wealthy. Today, they have no food, no clothing, and are thrown upon the necessity of charitable institutions for bare existence. Do you wonder why they do not smile? Why they are barely conscious of people around them? If the fate of all were to be that of these thousands and thousands of refugees, it would almost seem that the desperate effort of the Turks to wipe out the Armenians had almost succeeded." But Elsa writes, "Fortunately, it is not. The Armenians realize more keenly than anyone else that the hope of Armenia lies in the growth of its children. So an Armenian Central Committee has been organized for the establishment of hundreds of orphanages. Their work is supplemented, of course, by the Near East, but they are doing a great deal for themselves." Stanley was part of that Near East relief she wrote of, though they had not yet met. Stanley Elphinstone Kerr was born in Hopewell, New Jersey, to Reverend James and Marion Kerr. I finally learned where his middle name came from. The Kerr family had roots in Elphinstone, Scotland, from at least the 12th century, from there to Ireland, to Nova Scotia, to the United States. Stanley's father was a strict Presbyterian minister, but Stanley preferred science. He wrote, "What was it that first stirred my interest in chemistry? A great explosion and a black cloud at the Hercules powder plant in Wilmington, Delaware. That explosion led to a chemistry degree from the University of Pennsylvania, which unbeknownst to Stanley would help plot the roadmap of his life. He joined the Army and was working as a chemist at the Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Maryland when he heard that the Near East Relief was looking for workers to go to Turkey. He, like Elsa, jumped. His superior didn't want to let him go, but he then conceded, 'You win. They have orders to release everyone whom that organization asks for.' The Near East Relief was the United States response to Ambassador Henry Morgenthal's urgent pleas to save the remaining Armenian population from extermination in the Ottoman Empire. The documentary, They Shall Not Perish, the story of the Near East Relief, made by Shant Mardirosyan and the Near East Foundation, will tell you the full story. And I want to thank Maggie Goshen from the Ararat Eskija Museum for providing so many of the Near East Relief posters, and also a blanket and dolls that were made by the orphans and used by the orphans. So those are all thanks to you, Maggie. Thank you for bringing those. This humanitarian organization seized America's heart, conscience, and pocketbook, and mobilized an outpouring of goodwill and giving like never before. Everyone got involved, from presidents to movie stars to children, posters and billboards to save the starving Armenians, nationwide campaigns like Golden Rule Sunday. Milk cans, give a milk can and go see the movies. And bundle stations, send your clothes. It was massive. This lesson for children caught my attention. A is for Armenia, such a land of woe, where poor little children have no place to go. E is for Erzurum, and everybody, and Erzurum too. Everybody can help. Children, even you. The Near East Relief ultimately raised $116 million for the relief effort, worth well over $2 billion today, saving 132,000 orphans and caring for many more than that. Beyond material support, people like Stanley and Elsa Reckman Stanley Kerr and Elsa Reckman offered their physical beings to serve others. On February 15th, 1919, Stanley and 250 other volunteers boarded the Leviathan for a 3-week journey to a reality beyond their imagination. The Near East Relief had 15 centers in the Near East, and Stanley was assigned to Aleppo, Syria, where many thousands of Armenians who had survived the massacres and death marches were living in refugee camps and orphanages. Now that the war was over and the Turks had lost, Armenians were encouraged to return to their pre-genocide homes in southeastern Turkey, Cilicia, Giligia, with the protection of the Allies, namely the British and the French troops. The Americans' contribution was their humanitarian assistance. Aleppo was a clearing station for returning refugees. So they went there first for relief and then gradually returned to their former homes, now in ruins. The Near East Relief ran this enormous former Ottoman barracks with over 6,000 refugees, and Stanley set up labs here and other places, tested for malaria and all sorts of other diseases, and treated patients in hospitals. And in his spare moments was, quote, in the exciting business of rescuing Armenian girls from Arab harems. He always kept his sense of humor, even in the most difficult times. Stanley joined his friend John Dunaway, another UPenn grad, as they took their REO truck to nearby Arab and Kurdish villages to rescue Armenian women and children who had been taken as servants and concubines, and sometimes through goodwill during the genocide, to hopefully reunite them with their surviving family members. The children were often hidden, and the expeditions were always challenging and eventful. By the time they were done, they had rescued 450 Armenians, with many more left behind. Thankfully, Stanley, who called himself an incurable camera bug, had the NER's Graflex camera and took pictures throughout the next 3 years with the Near East Relief in Aleppo, then in Aintab, where he photographed almost 1,000 orphans, and he did that again later in Marash, and he would identify them so that people could know who's who, and there could be a possible way of matching them with their families. And also in Aintab, he saw the arrival of the French troops and the Armenian legionnaires who were coming to protect the Armenians who were returning to their homes in Cilicia. And he also documented many scenes in Marash from Armenians being nourished. You see Stanley there in that picture, actually, and several refugees. And they did this for thousands of people. And then fleeing in the snow, what my father referred to a few minutes ago, when the Armenians were left abandoned by the French, and many followed them. And this, the American Mission compound, where Stanley and other relief workers lived. To the left, at the very top there, look at that building with 6 windows. And then look at this picture here. When I went to Marash some years back with my father and a small group of journeyers, Armen Aroyan, who's a man who's gone many times and has taken people to find their homes and their past, where they're from. So he took us to Marash, and we were here at this building, and he said, this is the Bethel Orphanage. The Bethel Orphanage was one of the 5 orphanages that the Near East Relief was in charge of. They were in charge of all the orphanages in Marash and of all the orphans. The missionaries, the various different groups all kind of merged into the Near East Relief. And so Stanley was in charge of caring for all the orphans in this Bethel Girls, originally German run, but then Near East Relief orphanage. So he took me there. It's one of the few remaining buildings, and it was something that I've seen over and over again in historic Armenia, where even when things do survive, I mean, the Turks have wiped out almost everything that does remain, but if you look, you'll always find something. But in the city of Ani or Akhtamar, where there are churches and there are things to see, then there are signs put, and those signs never, ever, ever, ever say what they were. And here again, it didn't say what it was. It didn't say that it was an orphanage. It didn't say who built it, who ran it, why it was there. It just says, we don't know what it was. And then there's wood and there's metal. And the building is said to be genuinely school. That's the closest we got to it. So these are, of course, Stanley Kerr, Elsa, and Stanley's sister, Marion, who also went later to join the effort. They embraced the 20,000 people who resettled in and around Marash. I'm jumping ahead, but in the Near East Relief, April 1920 publication, I found this article and then a note written by a Dr. Crathern, YMCA secretary, who witnessed that latest wave of atrocities in Marash that we'll soon see. And he recognized the heroism of the group in Marash who was caring for the people, the Near East Relief. Kerr and Snyder were a royal couple, and by their daring bravery, they proved that they were true-blooded Americans and worthy of the highest encomiums, a fancy word for praises. They were equal to any task imposed upon them and were volunteers for any hard services the times demanded. Well, I've said enough now that the next video will seem very familiar to you.
But did we start? Well, this is, of course, where we should have started. The wedding of Elsa and Stanley in Beirut.
What do you know about this?
Well, they had something in common, didn't they? Even though she was 4 inches taller, they both had a mission for service. Here was Stanley's sister, Marion, and her husband, and some little girl, bridesmaid.
That little girl at their wedding in Beirut, 1922, was a child of the Armenian Genocide. Her name was Azaduhi, translated from Armenian, daughter of freedom. She was close to death when Near East relief workers found her lying alongside a road in once Armenian Marash.
At last she began to improve, and after 6 months she could walk.
I found that in the Rockefeller archives, the Near East relief records, and she ended up being flower girl in your parents' wedding.
Isn't that amazing?
And later, at the wedding of Marion Kerr, Stanley's sister, who also had met her husband as a relief worker. Like so many others, Azaduhi was nursed back to health by Americans who had committed themselves to helping strangers in need, survivors, refugees in faraway lands. The Near East Relief, a U.S.-born international humanitarian organization, was created in response to the 1915 genocide carried out by the Young Turk government of the Ottoman Empire. While most Armenians were killed, hundreds of thousands were left as orphans and exiled refugees. And that set the stage for young Stanley Kerr's and Elsa Reckman's arrival in the Ottoman Empire.
How brave they were to actually go there with a mission to help people, to save people.
When she was in Lloyd College, Wisconsin, she'd heard about the plight of people who were suffering during the war. And she learned about a program to go to Turkey to help. And the ones that she was particularly interested in was the Armenians.
I'm very proud of Elsa, because I think for her to graduate from college and strike out to a country that was an enemy country, I'm sure she was drawn by the needs of the people.
So she went in the spirit of a Peace Corps teacher. When she got to Istanbul, she spent a year there to learn Turkish, along with some other girls, young women. And they were going to be teaching in different schools. And she was supposed to go to a school in Marash in eastern Turkey, which was then very dangerous because they heard terrible stories about Turks massacring Armenians. And she was warned not to go. But she said, I came here because I promised to help them and I'm going to go. And that was what my father admired so much. He told us later.
Her father, then 25-year-old Stanley Elphinstone Kerr, didn't know Elsa yet. Stanley left Walter Reed Hospital in Maryland the year before, in February 1919, to join the Near East Relief as a chemist. Many detailed letters he wrote to his family in Darby, Pennsylvania, provide a window not only into Armenian and world history as it was happening, but into the enormous good he and others did as exiled Armenian refugees were resettling in their homes with the promise of protection by the allies who had won the war. After setting up a hospital lab in Aleppo to take care of the medical needs of refugees in camps and many in transit, Stanley also became the Near East Relief's unofficial photographer. He took thousands of photos of orphans and identified them, and documented daily scenes of people, places, and important events, including the rescue of Armenian children from Bedouin and other tribes who had taken and branded them as their own. Stanley Kerr is perhaps best known for his dedication to the Armenians of Marash, where he cared for many thousands of orphans and refugees who had returned to what was left of their pre-genocide homes. With the other relief workers and through unimaginable twists and turns whose details fill the pages of The Lions of Marash, a book he wrote 50 years later, Stanley gave his all to protect and sustain the Armenians trying to live peacefully in hostile, often deadly surroundings, where despite French troop and Armenian volunteer support, Armenians were still under the heel of the Turk. Stanley spent day and night treating patients in the hospital, crossed into the line of fire to rescue people, tried to help negotiate peace, and secured food and essentials for all the refugees and children in 5 orphanages. Years later, he described an important day in Marash, a turning point in history.
That morning, I had gone to the market to buy food for the orphanages. I came back shortly afternoon, finding the stores all closed and Turks everywhere armed, moving towards the Citadel. I got back in American mission compound when suddenly 5 or 6 shots were fired and then machine gun fire and rocket fire over the entire city. And the French who'd been sent out to capture the strategic points found that they'd already been captured by the Turks. In other words, they were too late.
The Turks wanted the Armenians out. At the end of a devastating 3-week siege between the Turks and the French, with Armenians the real targets, thousands of Armenians were massacred, and all their churches and districts were burned and destroyed. The French abandoned the Armenians and evacuated Marash under the cover of darkness, yielding victory to the Turkish nationalists. But Armenians, now defenseless against the Turks, found out, and 3,000 followed the French troops, walking 75 miles in the bitter cold toward the railway in Izlaihe, nearly 1,000 falling to their death, covered in snow. But in Marash, Stanley and the Near East Relief vowed to stay with the remaining Armenians, doing all they could to protect and sustain them. On February 9th, 1920, Stanley wrote home, "Dear Mother and Dad, tonight the French evacuate Marash, leaving those who have escaped massacre to their fate. Probably 10,000 have perished here in the last 3 weeks. Perhaps by remaining here, we can protect the remaining Armenians from massacre. If the Turks do not respect our flag and property, we will die with the others. Please, Mother and Daddy, and Marion and Stuart, don't sorrow for me if I don't return, but be glad that I have done what I could for these poor people. No matter what happens, remember that I am ready to make any sacrifice, even death, and have no fear." Ultimately, the remaining 9,700 Armenians were put directly into Stanley's care as he became director of the Near East Relief in Marash. That's when he met Elsa, who had come in dangerous times to teach at the Marash College in the American Mission, a school for Armenian girls studying to become teachers. In 1922, the Armenians were forced out of Turkey permanently, but not until Elsa had guided her students to graduation, and Stanley had delivered the last orphans to safety in Syria and Lebanon, which would also become home to Mr. and Mrs. Stanley and Elsa Kerr.
So Stanley and Elsa were married on August 5th, 1922, in the Near East Relief Personnel House in Beirut, a city that was now flooded with a new wave of refugees and orphans exiled permanently from their ancestral homes. And rather than enjoying the niceties of newlywed life, they focused on the orphans. 822 from Konya, 1,200 Caesarea orphans, he wrote. Where to put them is more than anyone can say. We now have in Beirut or nearby towns the orphans of Marash, Urfa, Aintab, Diyarbakir, Mardin, Harput, Mezreh, Malatya, and so on. 11,000 in all, brought from Turkey this last year. This represented, of course, only a fraction of the little ones being cared for throughout the Near East and the Caucasus. In Alexandropol, for example, today's Gyumri, Armenia, 20,000 boys and girls lived in the former Tsar's barracks, called Orphan City. And here we get a sense of the NER's reach. There were 53 orphanages and 26 sub-orphanages, 93 industrial centers. That's where they trained orphans to take care of themselves in trades and so forth after they left the orphanages so that they could thrive. Hospitals, you see all the work that the NER did. But Beirut already had several orphanages. And I want to say, if you want to watch documentaries, there is one called Orphans of the Genocide and another documentary, American Good Samaritans. These are all stories that are coming out about this experience, just so you know. So there were 20,000, so Beirut had several orphanages, but they needed more. And once again, Stanley and Elsa jumped in.
Helping Armenians was by now in their blood, and with thousands of orphans pouring into Beirut, the newlyweds asked to be given charge of a Near East relief orphanage there. They built it from scratch with the help of the orphans and Stanley's sister Marion, and became instant parents to an army of boys.
And one girl was my sister who was born that year in 1923.
They named her Marion, but called her Buzdig, little one in Armenian.
We are within 100 yards of the Mediterranean. With Marion and Elsa and I designed a building for laundry, bath, clothing room, etc. And construction on it will begin tomorrow. It goes quickly when started as the boys help the carpenters and masons. The plan is on the back of this sheet.
We're in search of the Nahr Ibrahim orphanage, where the river meets the sea.
With Stanley's sketch, a photo of the barracks, and my friend Garo Dedunyan from Beirut, I set out to find the forgotten site where the orphanage used to stand.
This is where the river meets the sea. And in Stanley Kerr's sketch of the orphanage, he notes very large trees, which are still here.
Oh my God. Oh my God. Look. Look the mountain. This is the place. We found it.
And exactly where it says our house on that map, we found one old home still standing.
Dorothy, Doug, grandchildren. This was likely their home. And the sea behind.
The letters they wrote from that home came to life before my eyes. Letters describing the boys' resilience, their beauty, and a surprisingly active orphanage life.
The tug of war was the most exciting event of the day. Our orphanage and Sidon having a great fight for the second place. The two teams were so evenly matched that they fought over 10 minutes without either side winning.
A generation of survivors who could now look ahead.
They're as good as gold while in school. That's one thing about Armenian children that's always impressed me. Most of them are very eager to get an education. Our orphanage school program is to give each boy sufficient schooling to enable him to enter college before he leaves the orphanage at 16. Well, it shows that they were really thinking ahead about the children's lives.
Stanley and Elsa's devotion didn't end at Nahr Ibrahim. Even when a deadly malaria outbreak forced them to close the orphanage and relocate the boys, they carried many of them under their wings into adulthood, promising boys like Azad Kachian.
Stanley Kerr, American University of Beirut, Megnet, İnci Hortel kadar. İyi havana varat orfanatların megun meçneyi Nahr Ibrahim, Dr. and Mrs. Kerr, look now, but Dr. Kerr's have into
By the time they had the orphanage, I think at that moment they must have realized that they couldn't leave. They were just too committed, and that American University in Beirut was a place where they could really make a difference for people in the Middle East.
After Stanley received his PhD at the University of Pennsylvania, the Kerrs returned to their beloved Beirut, where Stanley taught in the medical school of AUB for 40 years, with many orphans, now his students.
And having had such a wonderful luck to have had Dr. Stanley Kerr as my benefactor to begin with, teacher at the university, he was the instructor, the professor of biochemistry.
So many Armenian orphans became doctors. It's like they had to heal. Such successful people who came out of that horrible, horrible tragedy.
And with 4 children, Marion, Dorothy, Malcolm, and Douglas, Elsa became the cherished dean of women students.
My mother-in-law was my dean of women before she was my mother-in-law, before I even knew that she had a son. But she was ahead of her time. She was formidable, but very, very kind and fair. Kind of like her son.
And then came Malcolm and Ann, who planted their roots of commitment for each other, their family, the Middle East, and humanity under the big banyan tree, where their story began and continues to grow. Today, 100 years after Stanley and Elsa took those first colossal steps, their family, with 13 grandchildren and 19 great-grandchildren spread throughout the world, carries forward the living legacy of the warriors of peace who paved the way.
The Kerrs have a worldview that's truly a worldview that encompasses everyone in the world.
For me, the connection to the runs very deep. A week goes by, reading this, thank me for what my grandparents did.
All of their children and most of their grown grandchildren are involved in promoting human rights around the world. They're models for what we can be.
My parents also had a great admiration for the Armenians, because they saw what they went through and they saw how they really were dealing so bravely themselves.
My parents helped Armenians, but in my opinion, the Armenians that have met help our family more than we help them.
And the Armenians are telling their story, and it will be heard. And they'll win.
Hopefully humanity will win.
Humanity will win.
I should probably end there, but I won't. Humanity will win. So we come full circle to the present now, with the 5th generation of Kerrs holding on tight to the legacy, and a great-granddaughter named Elsa Belenkaya Kerr. Dr. Stanley and Elsa Kerr were the ultimate conveyors of humble and heroic humanity, lifting survivors from the abyss of genocide. And after their life-saving work in Marash and Beirut from 1919 to 1924, they stayed and educated and empowered generations of students, building an army of leaders around the world, some joining us tonight. The Kerrs retired in 1965, and in honor of their distinguished service, the Lebanese government bestowed on Stanley and Elsa the National Order of Cedars, Chevalier rank. The Kerrs moved to Princeton. I forgot. This is their award, their honor. And they moved to Princeton, New Jersey, where they were able to enjoy their children and grandchildren, family and friends. Time now for a simpler life. But Stanley's work wasn't done. The pull of the past was strong. It's interesting. I've asked former students and family members about stories they'd heard from Stanley and Elsa about the past. And it seems they gave pieces, but they kept a lot inside. Horrors they'd seen, dangers they'd faced, good they had done. Stanley narrowly escaped death many times in Marash, and Elsa in Beirut nearly died from malaria and lost a baby to it, while she was bringing 1,000 lost boys back to life. Not until nearly 50 years later did Stanley break open the chest of hushed memories and memoirs and more. The result was The Lions of Marash, published in 1973, 3 years before his death. And it dawned on me, could it be that in a way they carried a piece of the trauma that the Armenians did and do, bearing the pain deep inside, too heavy a burden, moving on to a better life for their families? I believe that Stanley knew that he could not leave this earth without honoring the truth of history and the dignity of the victims and survivors, without leaving a permanent record. So he did. In the last years of his life, and with Elsa's support, Stanley shared his story publicly and was honored by several Armenian groups, including Union of Marash and National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, NASR, who's a co-sponsor tonight, along with Ararat Eskijan Museum. And 2 weeks before his unexpected death, Stanley, Elsa, sister Marion, and her husband, Roy King, and other former relief workers were guests of honor at a grand Thank You America banquet in New York. Malcolm said about that evening that his father was deeply proud of this honor, and that at the ceremony he recalled his lifelong friendships with Armenians that began in Marash in 1919. He mentioned especially that it was then that he met and married Elsa. I wonder if Stanley knew that shortly after they met, Elsa had written home, "One thing is sure, I certainly would never have met a man so near my ideal in the States as Stanley Kerr." After 54 years of together, abundantly living and giving that ideal, Stanley was laid to rest in 1976 and Elsa in 1985, a year after their son Malcolm. But the extraordinary legacy that began a century ago with the original warriors of peace continues to grow. I want to take a moment to recognize their surviving children, Dorothy Kerr Jessup and Dr. Douglas Kerr and his wife, Mary Ann, who have also spent their lives championing human rights and helping others. And of course, our dear Ann. Thank you, dear friends, dear Kerr family, UCLA Promise Armenian Institute, for your exemplary commitment to Armenians and to all of humanity. May we all, in Stanley's words, make our lives count for something with love and hope. Thank you. Kisher Pari. Thank you.
What a magnificent presentation, like watching an entire documentary all at once, wasn't it? I would like now to ask our honored guest, Ann Kerr, and her daughter, Susan, please to come forward for a small presentation as well as a few words. It's a little bit heavy, so we are going to put it up here. So we can put it right here on the easel. So for Ann and for the Kerr family, on behalf of Ani and our UCLA Promise Armenian Institute, this is an original poster from 1915, Lest We Perish, from the campaign for $30 million worth, 2 billion or whatever it was you said, from the American Committee for Relief in the Near East, the predecessor of the Near East Relief. So an original print, just a small token of our great fondness for your family, for the generations of contributions to the Armenian people. So many blessings. Thank you. Thank you so much. And now we invite you to say a few words. There are microphones, I think, that perhaps you could bring forward. Here's a mic if you like.
There's no way we can thank you enough, and I hope I can. I hope I can continue speaking without getting too teary. But first of all, it's such an honor to hear Richard Hovannisian, doctor, professor, respected emeritus professor here, who started with Malcolm at UCLA. I can remember this skinny young man walking across the campus, and we were so honored when he then met Stanley, and Stanley was so helped by Richard in organizing his Alliance of Marash. And then Ani, that was truly an artistic masterpiece and extremely informative, things that I didn't know about, I think. How can we thank you enough? Beautiful. And Ann, thank you for directing this new center, and what a wonderful way to launch it tonight. And Eric Israelian, thank you for sponsoring and being the initiator, I think, of this family scholarship, family lectureship, which we really appreciate and look forward to hearing year after year from now on. I also wanted to say how much I appreciate your including my whole family, Malcolm's whole family, Stanley and Elsa's whole family, and that Elsa is every bit up there in the titles as much as Stanley was. And it used to be, and some of you remember, usually it was just the man who was mentioned, but now Elsa's being so recognized, as are her children and grandchildren, and we really, really thank you. I think turn it over to my daughter, Susan.
Hi. Oops. I think to say it's humbling to be here is quite an understatement. Thank you so much for, on a very selfish level, as my mom said, we've learned a lot about our family this evening that we didn't know before. I remember Richard when I was a student working on my thesis about my grandfather's letters and Stanley and Elsa's time in Marash, he gave me advice and information when I went to Marash myself as a 20-year-old. And I think you came to my wedding a few years later, and we were married, my husband and I, by an Armenian minister. So,
Right.
and
Simonian.
yes, Bahi Simonian. I wanted to mention just one thing about my grandmother, Elsa, which I learned a couple of years ago when I went with my second cousins, Janet and Barbara Reckman, to the place where Elsa's father emigrated from, a small farm in northern Germany. And we went back to that farm and we met our fourth cousin, Klaus, who is a farmer there still in the same place. And the boys, Elsa's father and her brothers, had made their way to Bremerhaven and emigrated as teenagers to the United States. And they went to Cincinnati, where there was a large German community from the same area. And what I hadn't known is that family, the Reckman family, were very involved in an orphanage in Cincinnati that had been established in, I think, 1850 after an outbreak of cholera. So that for me was a revelation, and it told me something about my grandmother's values and what she took with her to Turkey. And she had been farmed out. She and her siblings had been farmed out to live with relatives because their father couldn't take care of them. So she was, I think she empathized. She felt, had been orphaned herself. And I think the thing that's really struck me tonight was what Richard talked about, was that everyone we've learned about is a person. Everyone is a human being. And so that's what I will take away from this evening. And thank you so much.
Just to thank our wonderful, my neighbors in Bunch Hall, 11th floor, Hasmik and Emily.
Yes.
Yes, it's so.
Yes, our amazing staff in the Promise Armenian
Yes,
Institute,
all of
Hasmik
you.
Bagdasarian, Emily Pogosyan. We also had a good deal of help from Rachel Hekemin Emenecker, who is someplace in the audience here. So thank you again so much. And we will assist you in getting this to your car later. So thank you. We can put this down. I don't want there to be feedback. And so now we can open the floor for a few minutes for questions. I would like to mention a few things as you might think about a couple of questions you would like to offer. First of all, as Ani mentioned, this event has been co-sponsored by NASR, the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, as well as our wonderful Ararat Eskidjian Museum, and Maggie Goshen is here with us today, the head of that museum. If you wish to purchase the book that has been mentioned several times, The Lions of Marash, it is only available through the NASR bookstore online. So feel free to go to their website to purchase this book. I would also like to mention, as I've told Ann, that a number of individuals in our Southern California Armenian community knew and remembered very fondly Stanley Kerr and Malcolm Kerr. And a number of them have sent their warm wishes. We're not able to come this evening. One individual who was not able to come is retired professor, Dr. Humanitarian Armenian of UCLA, formerly of Johns Hopkins, also formerly of the American University of Armenia. He has written remembrances as a student of Stanley Kerr back in the spring of 1964, taking some of the last classes that were offered by him, a very distinguished biochemist. He really felt that he was a very great researcher. He has written a long document that I will provide for Ann to read separately, but he saw him as a role model, and he saw Malcolm as well as a role model. He served, Harut Armenian did, as a dean at AUB while Malcolm Kerr was the president. And so their families were very close, and he offers his very best wishes. So I will give you his statement here. So we have the opportunity for a few questions from the audience, if anyone has any that they would like to offer, or comments, or from our Zoom audience. I'm not sure if any are offering any. If not, that's quite fine. By the way, for those of you who are here in person, we have wonderful refreshments, even better than the ones we had available before, outside in our courtyard, which you're welcome to partake of. Any questions? We have one here. Maybe there's a microphone that can be brought to you.
My name is Armenian, and I want to, first of all, congratulate you on this work you're doing. And of course, thank you to the Kerr family. I guess this is a question to Ani. Since you're covering the Near East relief, have you done any research on the origins and the alternatives to the Near East relief? And particularly, I would direct you in the direction of the Library of Congress, the Roosevelt letters, Theodore Roosevelt letters in 1918, and the exchange between Cleveland H. Dodge and Roosevelt opposing Near East relief entirely and electing for the United States to declare war on Turkey, stating correctly, now that we know, of course, that the only way that the Armenians would be protected is not through the missionaries who the Turks, though Cleveland H. Dodge claimed the Turks would listen to the missionaries, which they didn't, is that we had to declare war. And the pushers of the Near East Relief Foundation, as I found through my research in the book that I published a few years ago, were the same people that financed the Young Turks, the Bolsheviks, and so on. And it was more of a thing for them where they wanted to depopulate Armenia of Armenians who were the rightful owners of the valuable minerals that those same people that were pushing for Near East relief had been granted concession deals, mineral concession deals. So my question is, because I saw what you covered here, it was great, but that little component, which was really important, of these missionaries were thrown into a fire that could have been avoided, and saved a lot more Armenians otherwise. So that, I guess that's my comment and question to Ani, if she's going to, in her final thing, maybe have some sort of mention of that.
I have a lot of research to do, and thank you for your comment.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments from the floor? Do you have one in the back, Emily?
Yes, thank you. It's such an honor to be here, and I'm so happy I came. One of the main reasons is I had a chance to hear Professor Hovannisian, who is my professor here at UCLA, and Ani, what a wonderful, fantastic job you did. And I just wanted to, my maternal grandparents are from Marash, and I had never seen some of these pictures, and it really it was emotional to see them, because my grandfather, Kerram Kargadorian, was one of the, at the time, I think he was like 14, 15 years old. He was one of the Armenians that followed the French out of Marash. And my grandmother, Azniv, that orphanage, it stands today because Armenians, the Turks, were trying to burn that building down. It was a sanctuary where Armenians fled during the massacres, but the Armenians kept putting out the fires every time that they were trying to burn it down. I believe that's the same building.
I think it is too.
Yeah, and so it stands today for that. My grandmother Azni was 10 years old in that building. So I just personal anecdotes, but this is a very amazing presentation today. So I'm very grateful to you for showing this, Ani, and I wish you the most success in continuing your efforts.
Thank you, Sara.
I think we have a question up here. Emily's getting a workout today.
Well, first of all, I want to thank for all this great information. My father was one of those people who were in the orphanage when the Turks put fire. And I believe it was the other orphanage, the Beit Shalom. Do you know I know there's that orphanage, but also Beit Shalom. I think that was the one that was put on fire.
They tried to put all of them on fire. Bet Shalom was a larger one for boys. The Bethel was for girls. And perhaps Bet Shalom is a stone building, because there was one other building I saw when I was there that I believe was an orphanage, and I believe was Bet Shalom. And perhaps that one was even harder to burn than this wooden building. But I can't say which is which, but I do know that there were 5 of them. And those 2 were originally built by and started by the Germans in the late 1800s, and survived through 1922 when the Armenians and the Near East Relief and everyone were forced out. But a few of the buildings remain. And the Armenian College, by the way, I mean, yes, the Girls College also still remains. So
now it's renovated. The Girls College is not anymore a college.
Yeah, it's something else. But the building is there.
Yes, they changed it to a cultural building as usual. Yeah, probably they burned both orphanages. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
My father has a question.
Oh, okay.
Or something to say.
I'd like to reflect on Mr. Manoukian's comment, which is entirely accurate, that Roosevelt favored the declaration of war on Turkey, and it puts the missionaries and the American board in a difficult situation. But their explanation, of course, part of it was selfish, and that they had invested 100 years in the Ottoman Empire, in educational, medical, and other kinds of institutions. And that if they did declare war, their worry was that all of these would be confiscated or ruined by the Turkish government, and at the same time, that they would be unable to continue their relief activities on behalf of the Armenians during the World War through the various organizations that had been created. It doesn't justify, but it makes us understand that there is a relativity that we have to be sensitive to.
Thank you. All right, well, I think we are ready to bring the evening in terms of the first lecture part to a close. Let us thank once again our wonderful, amazing speakers, Ani Hovannisian, Richard Hovannisian, for such an outstanding pair of presentations that puts the entirety of the Kerr family contributions and those of many, many other missionaries and humanitarian workers during and after the genocide in context. So thank you again for your attendance at this event, and we look forward to welcoming you to future events of the Promise Armenian Institute at UCLA. Thank you. And again, for those
What? No, I have to.